Hello, Internet, and welcome to the Deep Fried Neurons podcast. It is a podcast about stories that I find extremely interesting. And today's podcast is a little more different. For the first time, I'm sharing something that is directly a personal experience because to me, this experience is really powerful. And it's very close to me. I hope you like this show. And without any further ado, I'm going to cue the fucking. Guess what, guys? Another episode that was recorded at 2 a.m. now. It's not a 1 a.m. episode, it's a 2 a.m. episode. Upgrade! No, seriously, I need to take care of my sleeping schedule because it's a school night. I mean, not school night, college night, but you get the point. It's law school. I go to a law school. So, anyway, I'm doing this on a Monday morning at 2 a.m. and I have lost my aux cable for my monitor, so I have no idea what I sound like during the recording, but I'm pretty sure you can hear the raindrops in the background. That's because it hasn't stopped raining for the past 4 hours. And, there's a tin roof somewhere nearby, and that doesn't really help the situation where you're trying to record. So I'm gonna have to ask you to be patient with it, if at all. I can't clean it in the edit, but if not, you're gonna have to bear with it. It's not like my production quality has exactly gone up with time for this podcast. Regardless, today I thought I would talk in brief or at length. I don't know how long this episode is gonna be when I started it. About Diogenes of Sinope. Now, for people who don't know him, actually, you know what? Before that, I gotta give you a tiny little warning of discretion. Might include discussions about mental health and how it's handled in India. So, be careful as to you don't have any soft spots there. I'm just giving you mental preparation. It's now up to you whether you want to listen to me or not. Going ahead, but I'm going to talk about Diogenes of Sinope. For those of you who don't know, Diogenes was a philosopher of the Hellenistic age, right around the time, not the Hellenistic age, I'm sorry, during the reign of Alexander the Great, the Macedonian age, I believe. Is that what it's called? I mean, Aristotle was alive when he was doing his shit. So, Diogenes was this guy who was born in an Ionian colony. And the first image that you should get to your brain is he bought a big ass hole, like a jar, a really big jar where people store shit, kept it sideways in the marketplace, and he lived there by the wall, and all he owned all his life was a couple of rags, one piece of rags, and a bowl. Eventually he came to disown the bowl as well because he saw a child drinking water by his hands, and that's how he lived all of his days moving forward. And Diogenes was a troll, number one. I don't know where I read it. I don't even know the source is credible, but apparently when Aristotle used to define humans as biped featherless birds, he took the feathers off of a chicken and then showed it to the students of Aristotle and called it a human to make his point. And there was another episode where people were arguing whether motion exists or not, and how he disproved that motion doesn't exist is by walking away and thus proving his point. But obviously he was a cynic. The modern cynicism we're used to is a little more nuanced. It's a lot more driven towards the intent of a person you meet in society. But here it's met with all of it. I mean, it's a lot more holistic approach to the same, to the concept of private property, to the concept of societal restraint, to the concept of dressing up, to the concept of maintaining restraint or decorum, and things like that. And to a certain extent, teenage me would be very happy that I'm talking about this story. because I used to think like him, but I never actually ended up going to the praxis of it the way he did. And to be honest, massive respect. What am I idealizing to children? Let's be fair. I mean, Diogenes is a toxic example for you. Don't do it, kids. Don't live in a tiny bowl with a couple of rags. But the idea of cynicism itself spread through the talking about this man. So a lot of you might be familiar with the Stoic who was his contemporary named Zeno. Now, Zeno talked about like Stoicism in a way that resembles, loosely at least, the philosophy of hope for the best and prepare for the worst. So Zeno was of the opinion that a man must remember that he must be prepared and anticipate emotionally, physiologically, and logistically for the worst thing that can happen to him every day, and live that way for the rest of his days in order to have a fulfilling life in society. And the part of assumption of the worst came from cynicism. A lot of what we understand to be modern nihilism also came from cynicism, or existentialism as well, because I'll give you an example. For example, like once Diogenes was pushing his boulder up in the when the city was under the panic of war, and when he was asked what he was doing, he replied to the person in the city that I am trying to look as busy as I can while all of you do the same. And in the essence of literally pushing something up a hill and trying to look busy and trying to gesture the purposelessness of all our actions, he sort of shouted out to the Sisyphean nature of how the world has worked even at his time. This was before the Christ was born. And I mean, summarize Diogenes of Sinope as the ultimate sheeple warner. Basically, he wore as little as he could. He behaved like an animal all across, and he had a very negative outlook on human society as to its utilitarian and philosophical purpose and statement. And he would try to teach people to relearn what it means to be happy. What it means to be happy is to be primal. In a certain way, he actually said that the human species and the human society in general, if was to go extinct, he would regret that with the same intensity as the death of a single fly, or something along those lines. So you can imagine, quite spiteful. His spitefulness actually is pretty legendary. He apparently peed on somebody who was throwing a bone at him, because he was considered like Diogenes the dog, because he lived like a dog and dogs used to gather around him. And now I'm going to take a sudden turn, but after explaining who Diogenes is and giving you the context of person on Diogenes, I'm going to tell you about how I met him. Now, of course, I would be lying, and very obviously lying, if I told you that I met Diogenes at a club in physical existence, because he lived 2200 years or 2300 years before me. So now that we have that obvious lie out of the way that I mentioned in the title, I'll tell you what I mean. I mean I met somebody who embodies the idea of Diogenes in real life. And this is going to be a little dicey of a story to tell you, but he is a perfect example of what it means. I'm pretty sure this gentleman needed help and he never got it because of the circumstances that I was in, or like he was stuck in. I grew up in a tiny village in India, and the truth remains that these people were stuck in their circumstances. But I'm going to tell you about two men who I regularly had the encounter with, and they were essentially what you read in stories to be the village madman. No, seriously, there was no institutionalization for them to get help. I don't know how their families handled them, but one of them at least had a family. Um, every time I used to go to school when I was 13, I would come across this gentleman who would like stand in a corner and he would say, like, he would give speeches about Subhash Chandra Bose and Nehru and Gandhi and nationalism and patriotism at one instant. And then he would look at us children, he would call us out, and he would tell us that we shouldn't go to school, but do whatever we want in the restaurants or places where we hang out with friends, because that's where we will do the real learning. Basically, somebody who was completely against the institutionalization of education in the form of the schools that we had. And to be honest, I can't really blame him. I'm not very fond of the school I went to in terms of educational service. I don't mean they were ill-meaning people. I think they were ill-equipped people. And I don't mean to mean to break any hearts there. It's just true. I'm sorry. I'm not happy with the education I exactly got in high school, and I think it could have been better. But given the circumstances that I was in, I think that's the best I got. And it wasn't half bad. But moving on. That was me trying to be a politician, by the way. The point I'm trying to make is that after that, we used to see him in the town square or on the road to the school, just walking backwards. And eventually, of course, cruel kids being cruel kids, if he was passing by their alley, they would use stones and throw stones at the madman. And well, all we do is looked, really. I didn't know what to do. I was 13, 14. I mean, you decide if that's old enough to do something, but I didn't, because nobody around me did, and none of us knew better, really. That's the best I can give you, but you can judge my moral character on that. I can't and won't stop you. And when he was hit by stones, usually he would get hurt, and like kids would be shooed away by adults who were around eventually, luckily, or he would, fight back. But after he was hurt, especially when he was grievously hurt, that day and a few days after that, if he ever got out of his house, he would sing these very particular lines every day. I remember the tune, but I'm not going to sing it because my neighbors might wake up. And he used to scream at the top of this lung as much as he can for hours on end. Sometimes it used to get irritating for me. He used to say, "Abhi bhi ajnabi hai zamana, yaha kal kya ho kisne jana." The meaning of those lines is, even now, the world is a stranger. Who knows what will happen here tomorrow? That's like translated verbatim that I can give you, or the closest. And he was one of them. Now, this guy definitely had a family, because his clothes would always be clean, and it was very clear that he didn't care for them, but somebody did. So he would be changed, like his clothes would be changed, and he would be groomed from time to time, but he would be left out, or he would run out in the open for however long to do whatever he wants and go wherever he wants. And the other one was closer, because he was a prolific English speaker. Mind you, why that I was stressing on that, because this is like a tiny village. This is not a city. This is not where English proficiency is a recognized skill. Really, this, like, even my English when I was like, say, 10 was fucking horrible, man. It's improved with time, and I'm doing well now. I mean, I'm doing wellish now, but it used to be horrible, and it used to be an asset in the city. Luckily, I had the exposure to the outside world to develop myself to a certain tolerable point. But this man was proficient. He was beating doctors at speaking English, and that was because the second man had an MA in English, and he was a gymnast. And he was actually much closer to the conversations with Diogenes I was used to, because he would actually make people feel unwelcome and insulted in his talking. And if he wasn't doing that, he was performing in the road, as in, doing something weird with his body, holding a hanger in his mouth and walking backwards, dancing, standing on one leg, or standing feet up, hands down on his head. And he actually wasn't harassed by the kids as much, luckily. Oh, thank God. But regardless, the truth remains that he was doing those things. And why I say I met Diogenes through these people is because I felt like there was a clear resonance between the two. Of course, Diogenes' practice was a lot more deliberate than these two gentlemen that I mentioned. But the way they acted, the way they talked, the points they made in their speeches, and the truths they told us about institutionalization, they sort of resonate with these men. Now, of course, these are very powerful experiences that happened multiple times in my life, and they just left a very strong impression on me. And I never really forgot them. There are days when I wake up and I just think about him singing that song in that tune. I have no idea why. It just happens. It's strange. But what I mean is that a man who wanted to be destined to live only in the present, because cynicism of Diogenes sort of entails that he must only live in the present and nowhere else, lives all this time in the future. Diogenes, don't get me wrong, Diogenes did not give a shit, which means he did not write his teachings down either. This was a man determined to be forgotten. This was a man determined to live only and only and only in the moment. But nevertheless, somebody who saw him, found him peculiar, recorded all his behavior, and passed it on from generation to generation, to the point that educated men who came across his knowledge, probably came across his knowledge, this is of course a presumption, but even if they came across other knowledge which might be inspired by him, like I said, Nietzsche and Camus, like Camus' Sisyphean outlook on how life is sort of screams Diogenes, at least in its approach to the problem. And I just found it very mind-blowing that an idea like that existed so close near me and had such a background part in my childhood. I don't know what both of those men are doing. I hope they're well. Definitely I haven't seen them when I go back home. So I'm hoping they're getting help. But the truth remains, given the condition of how the institute that provide mental health care are in the area I'm talking about, it's more likely that they died, probably on the street. I don't know, man. That's all I have for you guys. Sad note ending. Bye. If you found this podcast resourceful or entertaining, please subscribe to me on YouTube, and you can always like me on Instagram and Facebook, where I share memes. If you think this content is too heavy, just to balance shit out and blow some steam, regular things. And support me on Patreon if you think the content is worth it. And you can find my podcast almost on every major podcasting platform. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Bye.